You've entered Bookstorm. Your favorite authors are here to dive down deep into their best-selling books. Stay tuned to brave the storm.
Welcome back to Bookstorm Podcast, listeners. I'm Kristen Civiletto, and with me is Julia Noel Rose. And we are just thrilled that you're here. You're tuning in from 102 countries and territories, all 50 states, and 2,100 cities. And why? We know why. It's because we are bringing you the very best authors. And today is no exception. We are just absolutely thrilled to have New York Times and Pulitzer Prize winning author Caroline Fraser. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, we are thrilled. Today we're talking about your book that is about to launch called Murderland and Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. This book is phenomenal. It is phenomenal. And we're going to talk all about it. In fact, I was giddy reading it, showing portions to different people. But I want to tell our listeners a little bit about your background. Many people do know you from actually two of your previous books that are very famous. You are the author of Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. That book won the Pulitzer Prize. It won the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Heartland Prize, the Plutarch Award for Best Biography of the Year. Now, you're also the author of God's Perfect Child, Living and Dying in the Christian Science Church, and your writing has appeared all over the place. The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, Los Angeles Times, and you've written for many of those publications as well, which is very evident, by the way, in your book. It is meticulously researched, but also enthralling. Somehow you've written a nonfiction thriller.
Well, it's wonderful to hear you say that, because that was what I was hoping for. I was trying to write about a topic that I think, is hard to get into. I mean, in terms of the whole lead and lead crime hypothesis, it's a, complicated and abstruse topic, which I think most people might not be interested in reading about on its own. But I think it is an incredible story when you start looking at the history of how we have, as a society, allowed so much pollution to happen in our country, and that it was sort of inevitable in some ways as a result of, development and just, the economic importance of developing all these smelters and factories and so forth. But I think that, bringing the two topics together, the lead and the crime, the serial killers, which, is maybe a little bit outlandish, and where they came from or what caused this rise in violent crime and a rise in the number of serial killers. I was hoping that would create, I would be able to create a kind of narrative around that would bring people to the issue that might not otherwise be interested.
Well, you sure did. In fact, I want to read a quote from Wright Thompson, who wrote The Barn, The Secret History of Murder in Mississippi. Many people have read that book, but this is a great quote. He says, "This book is a mapping of murderers and their victims, yes, but also of the battle between nature and society, a battle staged out on the edge of America and in the hearts of the people who live there. It started by trying to understand why so many killers come from the Pacific Northwest, but by the end, it had cracked open the most taboo corners of the American psyche. This story is a menace and a beauty. It left me deeply unsettled by the idea of monsters, by the myth of free will, and by all the realms of cause and effect that remain unexplored." I believe it's a groundbreaking book. And we're just so excited to talk to you about it today. I know Julia wanted to maybe give a little bit of an introduction, and I'm going to stop talking at this point because I could go on and on for 2 hours, and I don't want to keep you here that long.
Yes, so we did. We have a brief summary, and please feel free to add anything that you think, you want to touch on, or maybe that we're missing. But we wanted to give our listeners just kind of an idea of the book. So Caroline, you grew up in the shadow of Ted Bundy, the most notorious serial murderer of women in American history. You were surrounded by his hunting grounds and mountain body dumps in the brooding landscape of the Pacific Northwest. But in the 70s and 80s, Bundy was just one perpetrator amid an explosion of serial rape and murder across the region. And you started your research asking, why so many? Why were they significantly more nightmarish and gruesome than maybe what the population had been used to? There was the senseless rise and a sudden fall of the serial killing epidemic, and you wanted to investigate this. And this book begins by trying to understand why so many killers came from the Pacific Northwest. And I think that question evolved into something so much larger. So, as we mentioned earlier, in this nonfiction thriller, you take readers on a quest into the dark heart of the real American berserk. Did you have anything that you wanted to add or go maybe more into detail about?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how many of your followers are uh, familiar with the 1970s. If they were born after the 1970s, they may not remember um, quite what it was like to be in this country at that time when there was a really extraordinary rise in the rate of violent crime. And living there at the time when Ted Bundy was active, I was certainly aware of him. Um, I was not aware, however, of a number of other serial rapists and killers that were active at the same time, whose names are just not as famous. There was Warren Leslie Forrest, who was killing people in 1974 when Ted Bundy was also killing. And he was down south in the town of Vancouver, Washington. Um, and the more I found out about this, I mean, the Pacific Northwest has always had this reputation, but the more I found out about it, the more startled I was by really how extraordinary that history was. Even on a place like Mercer Island, where I grew up, which is a fairly prosperous, and well-to-do suburb of Seattle. And I found out about, murderers and arsonists and crimes that were happening on the island that I had had no idea of when I lived there. So to me, it was sort of a personal journey as well as a kind of historical analysis.
Right, absolutely. And I actually love hearing and reading and seeing stories that honestly come from the heart and, something that you experienced and didn't just have a question of why, but something you felt drawn to and compelled to. And I think that really came across in your writing.
Great.
So, in the beginning of your book, you make a lot throughout the book, you make a lot of parallels between geography and nature and people. And something that drew my attention was the Olympic Wallowa lineament. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
I think so.
Um, and I think it sets up a lot of themes in your book, and this mysterious feature offers a hint that what lies beneath the surface of anything, people, geography, the earth, might not be exactly what it is. It's deceptive, it could be dishonest, and it gives to this false front. And as you put it, the earth looks safe here, but isn't. And the longer we look at it, the more we see how it's broken. And where might it break again? Is that something that we can predict? So I noticed this parallel between geography and people. And can you talk a little bit about the deceptiveness of human created problems? So, specifically, unsafe bridges, unsafe people, and can we predict those and where those might break?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's kind of a major theme in the book because uh, growing up with all these, things that were dangerous including the floating bridge, which ran from Mercer Island to Seattle and was really kind of the end of Interstate 90. It was a federal highway and it ran right across the island. And it became really notorious when I was a kid for having all these really gruesome accidents, which were caused by things that everybody could see. I mean, in the middle of the bridge, there was this thing called the bulge, which which was just a sharp turn. You had to make a kind of turn at highway speeds around this mechanism that opened the bridge for traffic. And also it had a reversible lane, that wasn't the only example of that. I think that there were reversible lanes on other bridges and highways in the country. But this one was particularly bad because it was on this floating bridge. And so there were so many accidents, and everybody knew that it was, caused by these obvious, issues, the reversible lane and the bulge. And yet the highway department for many, many years refused to do anything about those issues. And so that becomes, I think, a metaphor for a lot of other things in the society that we knew were a problem, or somebody knew they were a problem, but nobody was willing to pay the cost of dealing with them. And I think it raises the larger question of how did we get here? How did we get to a place where it doesn't really matter to us that it costs human lives to have a convenient, bridge, or to take a certain number of minutes off our commute, or, it's just easier not to fix the problems that occurred with the construction of this bridge. And the same thing with the smelters, in Tacoma, Washington, which is where, as I point out on the first page, these various notorious murderers either grew up or spent significant time. Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, and even for a while, Charles Manson. Tacoma, Washington had a lead, later copper, and arsenic smelter right in the middle of the city. I mean, it was right in the city. And the smokestack that they had constructed was putting tons of lead and arsenic into the air. And people have known for thousands of years that lead and arsenic are poisons. This was not news. This was not, something that was controversial, right?
Right. They
We
can't feign
knew
ignorance.
that they were poisons. We knew that it was bad for those things to be breathed in the air, to be put into the air. And yet, it was for years the owners of the smelter, the Guggenheim family, the Asarco Company, the American Smelting and Refining Company, basically acted like this wasn't a problem, and that anybody who questioned it was, the enemy of jobs and the economy, and so it was just tolerated. And again, I think we have to ask, how did we get here exactly? Wasn't this crazy to tolerate something like this for decades? Even though it was obvious that men who worked in the smelter were getting sick, were getting cancer, even though it was obvious that there were all kinds of other consequences to the environment. I mean, people had um, substances eating through the paint on their cars and the finish on their boats, and their pets would die, and the smelter people would give them a few dollars to replace their pets. you know, and if it was doing all that, if it was taking the paint off your car, what was it doing to you? You know, I mean, that seems like a reasonable question, but people were just not engaging with that as an issue.
Yeah. Boy, that is so well put. I'll tell you, interestingly enough, at the other end of 90 is where I am in the Buffalo, Niagara Falls area. And so it's just interesting to me that, as you point out, we've got these man-created disasters and they were tolerated for so long. Maybe you mentioned convenience, the convenience of having certain chemicals, certain products, certain industry, but underlying all that maybe is profit.
Oh, absolutely. And there's no question that the operators of the Tacoma smelter, for example, knew exactly how bad it was. And they were doing some of their own research. They were preventing others from doing research that needed to be done. Meanwhile, they were privately doing their own research and hiding the results of that. So they knew exactly how big of a problem it was. They knew in part because it had become a big deal down in one of their other facilities, one of their other smelters in El Paso, Texas, which coincidentally is where another really extraordinary serial killer grew up, about 5 miles from the smelter. And that was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Um, so
Yeah.
they definitely knew. They knew, they covered it up. And they increasingly were in a hurry throughout the late 60s and the early 70s to try to, get as much profit as they could in the last years that remained to them because they could see the end coming. They could see that their profits would decline uh, as soon as the EPA and various other regulations caught up with them. They could see that that was going to make it impossible for them to continue. Uh, and so, but instead of, stopping what they were doing, they just speeded it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you point out, the nation was having an awakening in terms of air pollution, at least at that time, too. So there was that added pressure of trying to make as much money as fast as possible. I want to, though, go back to something you had just said. You were talking about how these companies were doing their own research. They knew that their products were harmful. And as you've pointed out, we've known that some of these things like arsenic and lead have been harmful for eons. But they had experts that were putting statements out to the general public and to the government. In fact, I want to quote one of them. You had talked about Robert Kehoe, a medical doctor who argued for decades that adults with blood levels of lead measuring up to 80 micrograms per deciliter will, quote, do just fine. Do you think that he actually believed these preposterous things he was saying? And where is the accountability? Is it too late?
Well, for somebody like Kehoe, it definitely is too late because he died in, the early 90s or something. Um, and as to whether he actually believed what he was peddling, it's hard to know at this juncture, um, without knowing a lot more about his biography. Uh, it has been pointed out by people who've written about him that the studies that he was doing were completely warped by the fact that at the time he was doing these studies, the control people, who were in the study would have had significant lead exposure themselves just from living in a country that had all this lead from leaded gasoline. So um, he may have not realized the failure mode of his own studies in that sense. But it's pretty doubtful to me that he didn't know on some level that the stuff that they were engaging in was really, really dangerous. There was certainly a lot of evidence just, from the early years of GM and DuPont and these other companies producing the component that made leaded gas, which is called TL, tetraethyl. It was marketed as ethyl, anti-knock additive for gasoline. That was very well known, how hazardous that was. It had killed some people in the early days in the 1920s and 30s who worked in the factories that produced it. Um, so the idea that he didn't know is not really credible to me. I think all these people knew. They were making money, and that was more important to them.
Yeah.
So you lead the reader through understanding this connection between early exposure to lead and later violent crimes. And it's a shocking theory, but one that makes sense when you consider the irreversible damage that these chemicals are doing to people who are developing, whether that's in your utero or in childhood or through consumption. Um, and in a backwards way, it kind of reveals that the killers are also a victim, of these companies and research and neglect and things of that sort. So what does that mean for society? Do we show a leniency to violent offenders that may have a history of exposure? Do we allow juries and judges to factor in their childhood environment or about the psychological harms inflicted by parents? Can you maybe elaborate on this like slippery slope in the legal world?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to exactly how the law would see these kinds of issues. But I will say I don't think I'm ever trying to suggest that somebody like Ted Bundy, for example, was a victim. I mean, he chose to do what he did. I think he was rightly found guilty for what he had done. Um, so I'm not trying to get into the sort of the victimhood of these people who were exposed to lead. I think I'm much more interested in the aspect of how we were all exposed. I mean, between like 1950 and I think the 1980s, really, millions of people had a blood level that was higher than it should have been. And there certainly is, I think, some cause, with this lead crime hypothesis, which people have now elaborated on and studied quite a bit. There is reason to think that lead played a part in the rise in the rate of violent crime. How much it played, we don't know. I mean, it might have been 20% responsible, it might have been 50% responsible, and we're finding out about lots of other reasons why people do these extraordinary commit these extraordinarily violent crimes, including, brain damage, concussion, everything they're finding out now about the kind of uh, prognoses that people have after having repeated uh, head injuries, concussions, and so forth. And there's a lot of other things that factor into um, these crimes. The FBI profilers were not wrong to focus on the whole issue of physical and sexual abuse, which also seems to play a role in what some of these men did. Um, but I think that there's enough evidence now that lead did play a part up to some extent, that I think we really should look at it. And I think that the real takeaway message, not how should we treat criminals who may have been exposed to lead differently, but simply that we shouldn't expose anybody to these substances to begin with. I mean, that's the real problem. And everything else in terms of trying to, predict what somebody's going to do based on their exposure, that's just science fiction. I mean, we can't really go there because every individual is going to be unique in terms of their exposure. They may, both in terms of the amount of exposure, the age at which they were exposed, um, and how their system dealt with it. People seem to have very different responses. When you read about some of the observational studies, there's a whole range of responses. Some children are become hyperactive and very aggressive. Other children, uh, sort of the opposite. They become slower to learn, um, and whatever the the opposite of hyperactive is, that they're just not responding normally to stimulus. So I think that trying to predict what we should do with people who've already been exposed, that's, after the horse has left the barn. I mean, we should really figure out how to stop exposures from happening and how to clean it up in the environment.
Absolutely. So essentially do better. And take this knowledge and do better for next time.
Right.
I want to ask you about where you just left off there, because a lot of times people think that these exposures and some of what you're writing about are all things in the past. We've taken the lead out of gasoline. We're hopefully not, allowing these smelters to just belch things into the air with no filters or whatnot. But I don't think that's true, because there's a legacy to this kind of exposure to lead, to arsenic, and to organic chemicals. And to me, these are generational impacts. Do you think that we have even scratched the surface of what it is we need to understand about these generational impacts? What's your thought?
Yeah, I think we have not even scratched the surface of what needs to be done. They are legacy pollutants. Once lead has been deposited in soil or in water, it doesn't go away by itself. In most cases, it just stays where it is. And so we have to clean it up. And this is what they've been engaged in trying to do. The Department of Ecology in Washington State has been trying to clean up, people's yards in the Tacoma area and that whole um, Pacific Northwest Puget Sound smelter plume for years now, and they're still not done. And they will undoubtedly run out of money before they are done. Um, you had asked about accountability earlier, um, which I didn't get to, but there was an enormous Superfund settlement for with ASARCO to clean up all of these various places in Tacoma, in El Paso, and all across the West. Um, Something like, $1.8 billion was the settlement. And I think in most places, a lot of that money has now, they've run through that money trying to do these cleanups, and they have done quite a bit. They've, done as much as they can, but I think they will inevitably run out before they're done. Um, the whole, what they call a primary smelter, which is what they had in Tacoma and El Paso, which was where they actually burned rocks, they burned ore to turn it into metal. Those places no longer, with a few exceptions, no longer exist in this country. They just can't exist because of our um, clean air and clean water regulations and the EPA. So almost all of them have been shut down. But there are still secondary smelters, as they're called, which are um, recyclers. They recycle batteries, the lead in your car battery. When you turn that into a recycler, they go to these places, which are themselves sources of a lot of air pollution and water pollution, and also very hazardous to work in. So the idea that somehow, I mean, we did remove lead, much of the lead from the air when they phased out leaded gas, but it's still an issue. It's still an issue for cleanup. You know, they're still discovering playgrounds and you know, places where a lead smelter used to exist. Nobody remembers it anymore, but they discover that there's lead in the soil that came from a smelter or something else. So I think all these cities in the United States, Chicago, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, you know, New York, I mean, all these places where we had smelters, um, that legacy still has to be dealt with. And in addition to that, there are still a lot of refineries are operating in this country, which are putting all kinds of pollutants into the air, which is why, you know, that whole stretch of Louisiana is called Cancer Alley.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to add to that because to me, this is part of your monster theme. The fact is that as we do these cleanups at Superfund sites, at homes, whatever, all of that hazardous waste has to go somewhere too.
Yes.
And when we put it right into a landfill, if it's solid waste, well, now that rises another day because all landfills leak eventually. If we incinerate it, we're putting fly ash into the air, and that also has to go somewhere. It's just this cycle of death. And again, your book doesn't read like this. It's dealing with these heavy duty subjects, but you do it in a thrilling way that causes us to stop and say, what are we doing? What are we doing? And,
Yeah.
right? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it going forward? And I won't give away anything, but at the end of your book, you really challenge the reader to start thinking about now what?
Yeah, I hope people take away from it not, you know, a sort of sensational thing about, you know, serial killers, but really a more kind of um, deeper question about what, why did we do this? Why
Absolutely.
didn't we care enough to really, you know, I mean, there were sure lots of things we didn't know, but why didn't we, you know, make different decisions? And I mean, I don't want to come across as a socialist or something, but I think it ultimately goes to the way we think about corporations and
Yes.
corporate responsibility. And if we don't acknowledge that corporations have to be responsible
Yes.
to a degree that we have not yet imposed on them, then I think we're just going to keep dealing with the same problems.
Absolutely. That's very well put. And I think we're talking about ethical capitalism, right? Nobody's saying that business shouldn't run and capitalism shouldn't happen,
Right.
but and we shouldn't have to impose those requirements. That's the whole point of the ethical capitalism. So I love it because you touch on so many fantastic subjects in your book, but they all weave together into a cohesive story. And I want to show our listeners this cover one more time because it's pretty cool. And I want to tell them too how to get in touch with you so that they can read this book. You've got a fantastic website at carolinefraser.net, and it's Fraser. And you're also on Facebook, on X, on Instagram. And I know that Julia had a burning question before we let you go.
I do, I do. Well, first, thank you for interviewing with us. This was informative and interesting, and a frankly thrilling take on not just the topic of serial killers, but I think a core part of our American history, and we need to learn from it. So we really appreciate you. And we're kind of looking for what's next, what's on your radar, or anything that is bubbling up for you.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm not entirely sure yet. I'd love to do another biography at some point, so I may turn to that next, but I haven't really decided yet. I'm just trying to, you know, push through the various tasks at hand and you know, talk about the new book and you know, it'll be really interesting to see what people think of it and have to say about it. But I really have enjoyed talking to you, and it was a great pleasure. And thanks so much for having me.
It's wonderful. All the best to you, Caroline. You take care now.
Thanks a lot.
Right. What an interview.
Well, I am blown away by
Yeah.
that interview because let me tell you, these are things that we should have been talking about 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think that Caroline just causes the reader to sit back and say, what happened? How did this happen? What next? What do we do? And I hope it spurs research. I hope that there's a tsunami of interest in these topics because it affects everybody, as she pointed out, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me is when we were talking about um, what we can do, we have to do better, right? We have to do better. And I think that people need to have some foresight. And I want people to read something like this or this book. We want you to read Murderland, but you read something like this and start really asking questions and digging deeper and not turning a blind eye to things that are going on right now. Because we don't want another book in 30 years writing about something that we could have stopped and nipped in the
Yeah.
bud right now, right away. So I think it's really gonna take some, I don't know, take some deeper thought to come to have something come from this.
Yeah.
So,
And that is going on, right? We have red dye in
right,
our foods. We have methylene chloride in our decaf coffee. Why? This shouldn't
right.
be. Well, I agree with you. All right, I'm going to tell our listeners about some other fantastic authors that we have coming up. And this is just a little short listing of what we've got. We are just so excited. We've got Christina McMorris with The Girls of Good Fortune, Adriana Trigiani with The View from Lake Como. She's coming back, as is Christina. Maggie Stiefvater, The Listeners, Ryan Steck, Monarch, Rick Mafina, If Two Are Dead, Chanel Cleaton, The Loft Story of Eva Fuentes, Jesse Rosen, All the Signs, and Tess Gerritsen, The Summer Guest. And listeners, we are growing every week. We're so thrilled that you're sharing our socials, you're tuning in. We ask you to go ahead and subscribe so we can keep bringing you these fantastic authors. You can find us on Instagram, on X, we're on YouTube, and we have our beautiful website with bookstormpodcast.com. And we know why you're tuning in because your favorite authors are here on Bookstorm, right here live. And we are just thrilled that you're coming back week after week. Have a great week, people.